Hi, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I'm pleased and privileged to introduce Mrs. Cynthia Skuman to you this afternoon. Cynthia is the founder and managing director of Ethics Monitoring and Management Services, and she's also the founder and non-executive director of the Ethics Practitioners Association and its current chair. She also finds time to sit on the Ethics Committee and Endangered Wildlife Trust. She has over 15 years' experience in the field of workplace ethics and governance and is a published author in this field, having written 2 books and an ethics guide with further contributions to 2 chapters for other publications. Cynthia has extensively lectured on ethics and governance as external faculty since 2000 at South Africa's top business schools and is a regular speaker at conferences. She has a BA from UNISA, an MBA from Wits Business School, and an MPhil in Applied Ethics, cum laude from Stellenbosch University. In addition, please allow me to welcome our attending NEC members and panelists for today, Mr. Bradley Beckerlich, Mr. Jason Chin, and Ms. Kirsten Gibson. And then without any further ado, I'll hand you back to the capable hands of Angela and the team and invite you to actively participate and enjoy this afternoon's presentation. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thanks, Audrey. And Angela, I'm sure you're going to put the slides up, but thank you for the welcome. It's lovely being part of this organization and being able to share the session with you. Angela, should I reload them?
Yes, please, Cynthia.
There we go. Excellent. So the topic for today, as you're aware, is looking at the ethical challenges of today and at a broad level and really saying, can we make better sense of this? I do feel like this is quite an overwhelming issue and it certainly does warrant our attention as professionals in the workplace today. And so if we look at this topic, what I'd really like to focus on is, as I said, that can we understand it, but with the point of understanding those key current ethical challenges to equip us to navigate going forward better, ideally, of course. And so what I'd like to start with, just very briefly, are looking at some of the basics of ethics. But before I continue, let me please reiterate what Audrey said of saying, please feel free to pose your questions, to put chat functions. Audrey and Angela will be managing that. And of course, we would welcome comments. This is not intended to be a one-way lecture, heaven forbid. In terms of the basics, before we look at these key ethical challenges, I think a key question is what constitutes workplace ethics? And of course, at a level, this is a very simple question because ethics is, of course, essentially about what's good and right. But when we're looking at workplace ethics, of course, what the focus of it is around achieving ethical or good and right behavior, actions, decisions, strategy, choose a word. And of course, and I'll elaborate on this next point just slightly, of course, it's not simply important that we get that ethical behavior, but that ethical behavior is enacted relative to others and well. But this part, I'm absolutely sure we could have all articulated. The key question then is, of course, we would want ethical behavior, but what are the key drivers in the workplace that we have at our disposal to try and achieve this ethical behavior? And really, there are 3 key drivers that we need to be aware of. Leadership is, of course, a huge one. It is by far the most impactful factor, of course, not the only factor. You would easily be thinking, rules, definitely laws and rules are a big factor. But the one we shouldn't miss is that within the workplace, values are one of the big drivers we have. And then, of course, I sometimes will refer to that third block simply as rules. It's just an unnecessary abbreviation because what I'm referring to are, as you can see, laws, rules, regulations, all rule-based mechanisms. So I think that that's very straightforward. two factors I'd like to share, two quick concepts before we get into the actual topic. And the one looks at unethical conduct. Now here again, ethical conduct we've all got is extremely desirable. And, so we can clap our hands and say, yay, moving on, that's the good stuff. But in terms of unethical conduct, I think it's worth pausing to extract something out of this. And the key statement that I'm basing this on is, as you can see, the point that in the vast majority of cases, I would put it to you that your employees already know what's right or wrong. When someone pinches their colleague's cell phone, I know we're not in the office anymore, so maybe not a perfect example, although I bet you're in the office, your work, much of it can't possibly be remote. But when someone pinches a cell phone or anything else for that matter, they didn't have a complete collapse of understanding of what right or wrong is. Of course, they knew it was wrong, but they did it anyway. And so when we look at the simple point of the vast majority of cases, your employees already know what's right or wrong. The implication of that statement is important to recognize. And the implication I always describe, as you can see under the banner of understanding ethics, as what I call a knowing doing gap. In other words, we in almost every situation have perfectly sound knowledge of what's right and wrong. But can we please recognize that that knowledge does not automatically translate into doing? That you know what's right or wrong doesn't mean the taxi driver, of course the taxi driver knows he or she should stop at the red traffic light. But the knowledge doesn't necessarily determine the action as you would appreciate. Again, taking that one step further is something important I think we need to do. That if we're then focused on looking at improving ethics, given this what I call knowing doing gap, can we please recognize that improving ethics doesn't only derive from adding more and more and more knowledge, the minutiae of the code of conduct? Crucially, what you need to do is to focus on that middle zone from knowing to doing. In the middle of that is choice. That's when I look at it. I know it's right or wrong. Now I make a choice. Good, bad, right, wrong. And that choice, of course, influences the action that follows. So I wanted to share that one concept with you. And there was a further concept that I said I'd elaborate on under the little text block of self and other. And this is pertinent, of course, internationally, but for historical reasons that we'll understand, is a very pertinent issue in our country. And I refer to this concept as ethical boundaries. King Forward referred to it as stakeholder inclusivity. But what it's looking here, and let me interrupt myself, I love the concept, the visual concept of boundaries, which, as you can see, I use from inclusive to exclusive. What I'm looking at here is you could almost picture a national boundary. In other words, who in your ethics boundary is included within your ethical boundary to whom you would then behave ethically and treat fairly. And the big question is when we're looking at exclusive ethical boundaries, here we're obviously not looking at exclusive a la Gucci. What we're looking at here is who is outside of that boundary, who is excluded. And this, of course, should apply to all your stakeholders and the triple bottom line concept. And a wonderful quote here that I think is worth bearing in mind always in regard to ethical boundaries and the intentional inclusion of our stakeholder is this comment by Joe Gerstand, who's a diversity consultant. That inclusion needs to be intentional, deliberate, and proactive. I think he catches the intention of what we should be doing extraordinarily well. So two very quick concepts that I wanted to share with you before we move to the topic at hand. And here, if we look at the current key ethical issues, the first thing we've got to look at is, of course, this is happening in a particular context. Now, I have put up just a few factors there, as you can see. And if we had time and we were chatting to each other, I'm sure you could add a host more factors. But of course, the context in which these ethical challenges are happening makes a huge difference. And so within this particular context, if we're looking at the current challenges, the three issues that this topic has focused on is, of course, widespread corruption, which, let's be clear, is not only state capture related. We're looking at countless current examples that you'll be as aware of as I am of corruption. We're looking at the recent looting as a very significant event. And I've added in the ethical challenges stemming from the pandemic. So within the broad context, there are these three focus areas that I will be looking at. And when we start off here with corruption, I think a core question, and we'll touch on it a little bit later, is that given the vast extent of corruption, never mind Zondo Commission or anything else, almost any billboard, any TV program, any news media you're picking up is honestly got so many examples of corruption. But if we look at this, I mean, just a couple of reference points. As you can see, it was actually October 2016 that the, of course, former public protector issued her report, The State of Capture. It was 2017 when all those Gupta leaks emails came out, and it was 2018 when the Zondo Commission started. So this has been going for a good while. So I want to pose the first poll question to you, Angela, if you can launch that. And I think a key question because of its implications. And as you can see, has corruption fatigue replaced corruption outrage? And here, I mean, of course, I recall all of us, going through stages of huge outrage, but is that still the case at the moment? Angela, I'll leave it for a moment for you to call once you think you've got a reasonable response in.
I'll do that. Only 35% have voted, so we'll wait another minute.
Thank you.
I think I'll end the poll now, Cynthia.
Thank you.
Would you like me to share the results?
Please. So has corruption fatigue replaced corruption outrage? 62%, as you can see. Yes, it has among the majority of people, and another 31% who think it's among some people. I'm relieved that 8% of you think people are still outraged, and it would be great to have a conversation around that. But the 62 and 31, is a very persuasive 90. How's that 93%? Never mind, it's probably a decimal point that is out there. And so when we're looking at corruption fatigue, thank you, Angela, I'll get to this point. If we're saying, oh, for goodness sake, I've just had it, can we see that when we're in a state of corruption fatigue, we would respond to the ethical challenges profoundly differently to if we were in a situation of corruption outrage? I mean, FYI, the same challenges relate to pandemic fatigue. The minute we are in a situation of COVID fatigue, the challenge is the negative implication is that we then fail to continue to observe the safety protocols that we should be observing. So exactly the same for corruption. Just as I say, broadly touching on these three areas, when we look at the looting incident, I mean, I don't know about you, but I promise you for 3 days I sat in front of the television in sort of horror at a level. But a point I'd like to focus on here, as you can see, is about leadership and accountability, is that I've just shared with you that, of course, leadership is a primary driver of conduct. Note I didn't include ethical conduct there. Because can we not fall into the trap when we say leadership is a primary driver of conduct? Can we not fall into the trap of only seeing that through a positive lens? Because, of course, there's that spectrum. Of course, there are wonderful ethical role models. But at the other end of the spectrum, what we saw in the looting, and I'm using the terminology there, is very unethical instigators. Were they leaders? Of course, they exercised a leadership role. They were hugely influential. And so that spectrum illustrates to us that leadership, yes, is a primary driver of conduct, but leadership can be a primary driver of conduct for good or for bad, for ethical or for unethical behavior. And that is compounded when the accountability that would typically go with ethical leadership is absent. When we're looking at that sense of impunity, let's recognize that on the negative side of that equation, it actually is exacerbated. And here I share this arguably cynically, but if we look at what state capture leaders have done, what the key people accused in state capture have done, it is, and I grant you, it's fractionally tongue-in-cheek, only fractionally, that the more looters claim they were only doing what those leaders did, excepting individually on a much, much smaller scale. Now, I appreciate that, this should have a longer conversation. I'm not going to go into it, but the point I'm making here is that we need to recognize that leadership, when it's coupled to accountability or not, can have a positive or a very negative effect. Finally, if we look just at a broad level at the COVID challenges, at a global level, of course, vaccine distribution is a huge issue, and I'm not going to dwell on that further, although I did think it was very interesting that at the UN General Assembly meeting now a little earlier this month, I noticed the Secretary General comment, "We passed the science test, but we're getting an F in ethics." And here he's referring to the equitable distribution of the vaccine globally. But I think in terms of ethical challenges, the challenge we're going to be facing in many of our workplaces is the whole issue of the views around to vaccinate or not and mandatory vaccines. So those are the sort of core broad issues that I have focused on in terms of this talk. And as the outline of the talk said, it's looking at what's the impact of these issues, what are the lessons we should be drawing from that? And then flowing from that, of course, is the question of what can or what should we be doing? And it makes sense to deal with these questions thematically, which is how I've looked at dealing with it. So if we start off with COVID-19, again, I would assume that being part of the Allied Health Professions Council, this is something you would be familiar with. The question of vaccination, to vaccinate or not, whether it's mandatory, these are huge questions, not obviously in our country, but internationally. And you would be very aware that, of course, our Bill of Rights does speak to that issue of bodily integrity. And, no one up until now knew what Section 12.2 of the Bill of Rights was, but now we all know what it is. And so this is certainly a factor that we need to be aware of. Having said that, there's some very noteworthy publications at the moment, among them saying, of course, the Bill of Rights gives us rights, but are they absolute rights? Are they absolute rights irrespective of the consequences? And as I say, the legislation around communicable diseases, for example, is one of the pieces of legislation that needs to be read in conjunction with this. As to mandatory vaccines, there are a number of countries where they have either made it obligatory for certain adults or obligatory to enter certain places. You would have picked it up on the news. And here I've really just included a sample of organizations of country responses in terms of mandatory vaccines. Discovery here, of course, has said very clearly that all staff need to be vaccinated from the start of next year. Qantas, one of the airlines that requires it for their staff, UK, care workers, Italy, health workers, Walt Disney Company, Walmart, huge organizations like this are making it mandatory, if not for all of the staff, certainly for most of their staff. And as I say, it's a constant issue. I don't for a moment think that this is an easy issue, and I'm not sitting here with a magical answer. But what we do need to recognize is, A, this is a core board issue, that this is something that warrants the highest level of attention. I also flag for you that in so many ways, this represents a true ethical dilemma. That where we're looking at, obviously, on one hand, the health and ongoing health and safety of our employees and the stakeholders we engage with. But we do have to acknowledge that Bill of Rights freedom in terms of our right to bodily integrity and the freedom of choice. And the real challenge, of course, is that with any ethical dilemma, there is no easy answer. The choice your organization makes here, you can say, well, we've made a decision. But seeing we're talking about ethics, on the one hand, those people who have been vaccinated and who were comfortable to do so, they might well applaud that decision. But what about those who weren't comfortable to make that decision, who were, in fact, even strongly opposed to that? They could very likely see the decisions around mandatory vaccines as deeply unethical. Will it affect the organization? Will it affect its culture? The answer is indeed yes, it will. If we look at the looting, in fact, let me pause. I'm not sure, Audrey, if there are any questions or any comments in the chat so far that you'd like to raise?
Not at this point, but I'll keep an eye on it for you.
Excellent, thank you. And again, I think that posing your own comments and questions around these issues, we're not looking at ethical theory that is outside of anyone's realm. We're looking at the practical issues that we all experienced. If we look at the looting lessons here, I've already referred to the leadership. But the issue here is that when we look at laws, rules, regulations, codes of conduct, I made the point earlier that there are key driver of ethical conduct. Can we also recognize another very interesting role that rule-based mechanisms serve? Is that, have you ever thought about the fact that they preserve and protect values? Now, let me give you an example. If we were looking at an industry like the mining industry, and again, I mean, I appreciate that that is not your industry, but we're all familiar with it. There would be rules and laws and regulations. I mean, endlessly, you couldn't step on site without boots and a hard hat and whatever. Now, we could easily say, oh, for goodness sake, honestly, that industry is just crazy about rules and regulations. Or is the explanation something else? And of course it is. The reason an industry such as mining or construction or any of those industries have got such rigorous rules and regulations is that the value those rules and regulations serve to protect is, of course, safety. And so a very interesting perspective there. Let me just add as an aside at a practical level that if we're looking at rewriting an organization's code of conduct, we will often include this factor. Let me use the example. If you had a code on bribery, fraud, and corruption, we would start that policy with the first sentence saying, in pursuit of preserving and protecting the values of honesty and integrity, this policy applies to all employees, so that we link that as an important role. And the challenge is that when we see, as we did with that looting, that yes, of course, the laws, rules, and regulations were entirely flouted. But again, we're back to that issue of consequences. In the absence of consequences, not only are the laws and rules undermined, of course, by definition, compliance is diminished, but as I just said, those moral values are eroded as well. But another lesson that I think is pertinent, that comes out of that looting, is that trap that we can easily fall into relative to ethics in our organization, of only recognizing goodies and baddies. And as you can see, I've put it on a very perfectly distributed bell curve, but so be it. And of course, in real life, it's actually much more nuanced than that. And that middle group, if you want, yes, I'm sure that in every organization, there are those who are deeply personally committed to being ethical and would under almost any circumstance be ethical. And certainly in our society as any, there are real baddies, you know, who would seek out and try and create any opportunity to pursue an unethical end with some benefit in it. But falling into that trap of goodies and baddies ignores that there's that middle group, much like the bell curve illustrates, who can be influenced towards what's right or towards what's wrong. And here, much as I shared with you around the knowing-doing gap, please let's be clear that ethical choice precedes action. And the point of that relative to the looting is arguably a very tough point, because can we recognize that we all have the ability to make an ethical choice, and only in circumstances of real coercion are we denied that choice? So yes, in that circumstance, the choice doesn't exist. I'm not going to create an ugly word picture to illustrate that, but whether it was a situation of crime or something like that, then of course we could be denied that choice and we could be forced one way or another. But actually, in all other circumstances, we are able to make that choice. In terms of moving this into what are the implications, what does it mean we should or could be doing, the issue of managing this sort of hump of the ethics bell curve is really important. We can't either run our organizations as if somehow we have been so fortunate as to have only perfectly ethical people. This is not to now assume that we need to be suspicious of people, but in general, we need to recognize specifically that middle group that can be ethically ambivalent, that we need to include in our ethics management programs interventions that will positively influence this group. It's a core part of not simply assuming all our people are ethical, thank goodness, moving on, and that naivety around any unethical behavior is not to anyone's credit. But as I say, those extremes need to be complemented with an understanding that many more people are and should be positively influenced, obviously, towards being more ethical. Corruption is such a very big factor. And here there are a number of points that I'd like to deal with. I stress again here that when I'm looking at corruption, of course, state capture, consumes so much of our attention, but so too are there ongoing examples of misappropriation of funds, of other areas of fraud, of tenders being, illegally and inappropriately awarded. You're as aware of it as I am. And there are a number of issues that I would really like to flag in terms of what corruption, what the key issues are. So the first question here that I would love comments in the chat around is, in terms of ethics reporting, would you, in your organization, would you value an early warning of unethical or illegal conduct? Would you value someone coming to you and saying, gosh, you know what, I'm not sure about this, but this is looking very dodgy. And of course, with that early warning, being able to appropriately investigate, and if there is unethical or legal conduct, having that early warning to be able to tackle it and address it and of course eliminate it. Now, challenge of a remote audience is that, I can't even see if you're nodding your head. But the last time I asked this for a live audience, would you value it? I looked around and there was a lot of nodding. Yeah, of course they'd value it. Here's the next step, however. And I didn't use the word whistleblowers in the previous slide. I must tell you personally, I don't like the word whistleblowers. But how are whistleblowers really regarded? How are they actually treated? So on the one hand, we can look at it and say, yeah, I would definitely want to know that if you knew something was going on, or even you had a real suspicion something was going on, I would really value that information. I could nip it in the bud and deal with it. But how are whistleblowers actually treated? I'm using the example here of Cynthia Stimple, who's been in the news quite regularly. And it was a 256 million tender that was unlawful that she worked at trying to stop. Her story is not entirely dissimilar to many. She, of course, lost her job. The trauma and harassment that followed was absolutely shocking. So when we look at this, the corruption has one of its core, I almost want to say, themes, is that we have had many people stand up, many courageous people stand up to speak up and to speak out against corruption. But how are they regarded and how are they treated? Now, on one hand, I continue that there has been a great focus on the topic, increasingly so. You might be aware that Mandy Wiener wrote a book. I think that was published late last year. And Cynthia Stimple's book was published this year. So and in many other arenas, there has been a great deal of focus on whistleblowing. Again, I use the word because it's the broadly used word. But here's the catch. I'm sure you all know her name. Babita Deokaran was a key witness, as you would know, in the SIU's probe into irregular procurement of PPE in the Gauteng Health Department. And she was murdered last month. Yes, our president, passed nice comments about her, guardians of our democracy. But when we look at the question I started at the outset with, would you want to know if something untoward was going on? Of course you would. But how are we really treating whistleblowers? And throughout in our country, I'm going to pose a question to you in a moment around that. I think the evidence is really shocking. And I think Babita's death is really, it's not the first death of a whistleblower, but it's the most recent one and has really hit a very raw nerve. So I pose the second poll question to you, Angela, if you can launch that. So as you can see, it's looking at what's the impact of the country's efforts to address corruption relative to whistleblowers. And here, in terms of addressing corruption, I am talking about holding those who are guilty to account and to minimize and prevent further corruption. Do you think that the efforts to date in our country relative to whistleblowers, do you think this would encourage whistleblowers? Do you think it would discourage whistleblowers, or do you think it's neutral, that the impact of the various efforts to address corruption has had no impact on whistleblowers? So Angela, again, I'll leave it with you for a moment.
Just another moment, we're only at 45% voted. I think I'll end the poll now.
Discouraged whistleblowers. Well, I mean, a whopping 89% there. And I'm afraid to say, thank you, Angela, I'm afraid to say that I agree that if we look at the efforts to address corruption, much as we can easily acknowledge the value that those whistleblowers bring, that the courage that it takes to stand up, the reality is that we're not encouraging them even slightly. And so here, the key questions I pose that are pertinent in all our businesses is that key point I made earlier. How are whistleblowers actually regarded? The term whistleblower is not a positive term, but are they regarded as champions of ethics? Are they regarded as someone who really stood up for what was right against all odds? Or are they regarded as troublemakers, as informers? Now, I must tell you some of the very challenging facts around whistleblowers is that many of them have battled to get jobs after having come out as a whistleblower. Now, you'd think you've already established that this is someone who will stand up for ethics. Why are they battling to get a job? There's not an obvious logic connect, but what it's telling you, if you interpret it at an obvious level, is they're not regarded positively. And what's your organization doing to protect whistleblowers? Of course, I appreciate that we've got legislation. I'm sure that your organizations have probably got policies on this as well. But are you really adopting positive initiatives? Are you doing little or nothing? You're not even sure. Because were there to be something untoward, the impact on people speaking up is not just relative to your organization. You can say to me, Cynthia, come on, man, everyone in my organization, we trust each other. We'd feel comfortable to speak up. A point I'll emphasize later, but is applicable here, is that your employees are impacted by how whistleblowers are treated very broadly in our country within your organization. The source of influence that is the company and the leadership of the company is one source, but relative to whistleblowing, I would argue that what is happening to whistleblowers outside your organization is a far, far greater impact than just what's happening in your organization. A point I'd like to highlight as well, and perhaps not an obvious point, is when we look at corruption, I said that clearly whistleblowers are one of the themes that come out of this. And interesting, loyalty is almost a theme I'd extract out of this. And you might be looking at it and thinking, not seeing any loyalty here. But in fact, the cartoon is intended. Once in cahoots, always in cahoots. Now here, I'd like us to, as I say, looking at this topic at a big picture level. And I'd like us to look at the issue of what I'm calling loyalty among thieves. Now, you can call them thieves, you can call it loyalty among baddies, you get the point I'm making. That the challenge with being party to corruption is that once someone has approached, I don't know, Mary, let's use Mary as a name, approached Mary and said, now listen, Mary, we need your cooperation to get this fraudulent tender through. And by the way, there's a little kick in it for you, you know, a little bit of a kickback here. can you see that once Mary agrees to this, the binding cost, as I'm putting it, of corruption is such that when the person comes back and says, okay, Mary, here's another one, and she says, no, hold on, this was a one-off, I'm not comfortable about this. How do you step away from it? Someone's saying, oh, please. I mean, we've got the dirt on you already. You know, you signed X, Y, Z, did this, whatever. And can you see they now have leverage in terms of the complicity as part of corruption? So that's on the one side. The other side is that the rewards, please let's put that in inverted commas, the rewards of corruption also build a very strong bond of, if you want, loyalty, because pursuing those rewards on an ongoing basis becomes increasingly important. So I won't name the political party, of course, but I did notice with all the political party manifestos being issued at the moment of saying, you know, we're bringing in younger candidates and they won't repeat the mistakes we've made. Actually, why wouldn't they? If there is some untoward benefit that can be achieved out of the power of being in position, why would someone abandon it? So here's the choice. You can be a loyal public servant and serve the people, or you can utilize your power for personal gain. Interesting choice here. And unless there is very strong factors at play, can you see that the negative choice becomes an option? The other point I'd like to make about loyalty is a point that expands beyond just the current environment. And it's a real ethical trap, if you want. Here I'm looking at the issue of the core ethical dilemma of honesty versus loyalty. Now, honesty, of course, is a great value, but you know what? Loyalty is also a good value. Now, if you had to try and prioritize those, you might say to me, hold on, Cynthia, honesty for me is much more important. But can we recognize that when hugely strong bonds of loyalty exist, when you have been part of a struggle for freedom in our country over decades, can you see that the hardships that you went through have built extraordinary bonds of loyalty? And this is a good thing. But here's the catch. When you have such bonds of loyalty, can you see when Joe has pinched the petty cash, does loyalty come to the fore and say, no, hold on, Joe and I go back a long time. No. You don't get to rat on your friends. Or does honesty kick in where we say, this is theft? And so one of the issues that comes out of this real trap in terms of loyalty is that when we prioritize loyalty completely at the expense of honesty, can you see that we are subverting into unethical territory very strongly and very quickly? A fact I referred to a moment ago, and another key issue within the corruption theme, is that the scale of corruption is such that it is, I almost want to say it's impossible that it hasn't impacted almost all, if not all, organizations, small, large, international, you name it. And here, when we're looking at that impact, this, as I say, the corruption is so pervasive. We need to be clear of what that potential impact can be. Now, again, I want to stress that the impact of pervasive corruption is happening in the context I labeled, the context of high unemployment, of eroded education systems, of huge stress, of poor economy. I'm not going to go through all the factors. So it's in a situation where people are under really significant pressure at almost every level. And can you see that when we're looking at corruption again, without any apparent consequences, what it can easily do is drive lowest common denominator behavior. I'm sitting there saying, why am I the only idiot who is, obeying all the traffic rules? And suddenly now it's not the taxi who's jumping the traffic light. It's the little old lady in her Toyota who's jumping the traffic light. And of course, there are many more, much more extreme examples of this. But this is definitely an outcome of the pervasiveness of the corruption. The challenge in terms of this lowest common denominator behavior is that so-called slippery slope. And I always say, when I think of a slippery slope, the word picture I have is not a sort of gentle grass verge. I always say you need to see a really steep angle. Slippery slope, my material of choice, marble, slick of oil on top. And now here's the challenge. Once someone steps on that, if you've got the word picture, how do you stop? How do you get back up? And so part of what we need to be protecting our organizations from and our people from is that in the pressure that is part of our current context, avoiding that lowest common denominator behavior, not for the behavior alone, but that slippery slope has consequences that are very difficult to end or to improve. And of course, overall, this definitely will erode, if not implode, an organization's company culture. So I'd like to now pose the third poll question to you, given, as I say, the pervasiveness of the corruption in our country. What do you think organizations have done in response to such widespread corruption? And I appreciate that the 5 options here, it's just a single choice. Do you think, and I am generalizing, I appreciate that. Do you think little or nothing is just business as usual? Or do you think there's been particular focus areas, like focusing more on investigation or focusing more on consequences? Or do you think there have been more positive organizational responses? Again, Angela, I'll leave you to call that.
I think a few more minutes.
Thank you.
I'll show the results now.
Thank you. Well, isn't that interesting that again, a majority by good margin, that given the pervasive widespread corruption, that as I say, you need to be naive to think that it's not impacting us, that in your view, it's little or nothing is being done. It's just business as usual. I mean, after that, I do acknowledge 23% on investigating misconduct. And I do like the last one, 18% on looking at increased focus on both positively strengthening ethics as well as reinforcement and consequence management. But that 50% is quite an indictment. And, we're probably all perfectly soundly informed to be able to share a view such as that. So, of course, not the ideal answer. And moving from that exactly on that point, I'm using the hashtag here of keeping ethics alive. And the core question is, given what we've looked at under the banner of the various ethical challenges and very particularly corruption in our country, what are organizations doing to strengthen ethics among, and I think it's important to be doing it among internal and external stakeholders? And here I think we do need to be applying our mind. I don't think we throw our hands in the air and say, oh my goodness, this is, just such a disastrous situation. I think that as a core institution, in terms of, I say business, I broadly mean the workplace, I think we can and should be making a difference with our stakeholders. Ethical leadership is, of course, crucial. And I'd go so far as to say that without ethical leadership, I think that an organization's efforts to create an ethical culture are probably going to amount 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. It really is a key factor. And what I highlight out of that relative to leaders is that in this current environment, I would put it to you that trust is the primary currency that needs to be grown, protected, and preserved. That with greater trust, of course, what that implies is extremely positive. And so leadership is a key factor that we have to start with. A second factor that I'd like to look at is a very simple one. I'm describing it as a dual approach to ethics. But when we're looking at ethics, if I had the opportunity to ask you, most audiences would easily say, what's the primary intervention, what the primary programs that organizations have as regarding ethics? And the primary issue is a focus on compliance and minimizing unethical conduct via rules, regulations, policies, procedures, and the like. I'd like to share a little analogy with you to speak to a dual approach to ethics. And the analogy is this, that if you wanted to improve the profitability of an organization, the 2 big levers you have, I'm sure you're thinking of them already. Improve profitability, of course, you need to increase sales or revenue, and you can also reduce costs. Now, you'd also appreciate that reducing costs and increasing sales are very different mechanisms. Would they both improve profitability? Of course. Can you see this analogy applies so very well to ethics? If you want to improve ethics, of course you need to reduce misconduct, for which you need to focus on rules, regulations, compliance, and consequences and accountability. But here's the key question. What are you doing on the positive side to strengthen values and improve ethics? It's not just about reducing misconduct. What are you doing to strengthen values and improving ethics? And I often say, let me give you a clue. The answer to that question, of course, shouldn't be nothing. How ethics is positioned in the organization makes a huge difference. Is ethics actually seen as an asset, or is just a priority among other priorities? Or do you think it's even a potential liability? There could be that tenderpreneur who says ethics, no, that stands in the way of making good money. So as an asset, of course, we could write a laundry list of factors that would describe ethics and that position ethics as an asset. And of course, it really should be. But the point I'd like to focus on in terms of ethics as a source of value is ROI, of course, we would know as return on investment. I've played with that acronym, and the return on investment in ethics, I use the term return on integrity. Is there a return on integrity? And that return on integrity, I categorize as ethical capital. And here I think that when we're looking at ethics, is it a source of value? It should be a huge source of value as ethical capital. And finally, in conclusion, I got 4 quick scenarios that I'd like to share with you. I've shared the impact. I've looked at some of the factors that some of the approaches you can adopt within your organization. But the reality is, as professionals, the role we play makes a huge difference. So I share 4 quick scenarios with you. And here I'm adding unintentional ethical liability, because after all, you know, you are, if you want, by definition, you're attending an ethical course. But are we unintentionally an ethical liability? And here we're looking at things like unconscious bias, blind spots, latent discrimination. Of course, the catch is very real consequences for these. But I think this, among this audience, is not the pertinent issue. But the question is, are you ethically just a passenger? And please recognize that these questions can be posed to your colleagues and employees. And here as a passenger, and I mean, let's look at it simplest level. As a passenger, it means I'm not the driver, I'm not in charge of the direction, I'm not in charge of the speed, I'm not in charge of whether we abide by regulations, I'm just along for the ride. That sort of hands-off approach, ethically, I don't think that that is appropriate when we're looking at leaders and professionals in our society. An interesting one is, are you just a spectator, you know, sort of sitting on the stands? Now, 2 quick quotes I'd like to share with you then. You would be very familiar with the Edmund Burke quote around the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And of course, that is pertinent in terms of a sort of complete hands-off, disengaged role as a spectator. But in fact, I think Edmund Burke had another quote that is much more apt for our situation. And that quote around, nobody made a greater mistake than he, there was always gender things here, who did nothing because he could only do a little. And I include that point here because I think sometimes the enormity of the ethical challenges we face is such that we look at it and think, oh my goodness, how can we do anything? But ethics is like a stone in a pond. Yes, we might see those first ripples. We'll never know where those positive ripples ended. And if we all do a little, does it make a difference? Hell yes, of course it does. And finally, I pose the question, are you an ethical asset? And the answer is, of course, I absolutely hope so. But an ethical asset has got to be a proactive, engaged role. So I pose the question, what have you done recently and what will you be doing on an ongoing way that actively promoted ethics, not just for yourself, but among others? So I've got one last little video clip that I'd like to share with you that I think poses, again, some very real questions. So,
success without integrity means nothing. Your belongings don't make you a better man. Your behavior does. Integrity is how you behave when there's nothing to be gained. We make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give. Choose to strive for more, for better. Every hour of every day, be the man of today. Boss Bottled.
So again, I, as an aside, acknowledge that the gender specifics of that couldn't easily be changed, but the key question there that I pose at an overarching level is for us personally, professionally, and in our organization. Can we make a difference? Of course, we can make an enormous difference if we so choose. But it comes down to that core question of what constitutes for success for us. And is integrity absolutely solidly embedded in that success? I certainly hope it is. And can I say thank you once again for inviting me to share this with you.
Cynthia, thank you very much once again. I think you've given us amazing lot of information to think about. And if we can even just start with the little pond in the stream or the little pond in the dam, I think we're getting there. But thank you once again. We hope to see you. Thank you for your time, and again to everybody else.
Thank you, Cynthia, for a wonderful talk. Unfortunately, a lot of our industry is often driven by a sense of or a need to earn a living, and it can lead to a lot of our colleagues doing unethical things. And I hope they've see the light and remember to improve the integrity of us as professional orthotists and prosthetists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
There are no more questions.
In that case, Audrey, thank you very much for inviting me to share some thoughts with your organization, and I hope that we'll have the opportunity again in the future.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Take care.